Hi, I'm Gavin,
I'm Ryan.
and welcome back to the Sound Project. All right, so today we're going to be talking about classroom acoustics.
Yep.
So we get involved with a lot of different types of projects, and a lot of them are in educational facilities. And sometimes we're doing recording studios in these spaces. Sometimes it's a lecture hall or just there's a lot of different spaces that acoustics is really critical for in these educational facilities. So classroom acoustics in particular, we're going to talk about that because there's some standards that you need to hit, and we'll just kind of jump right into it. So the National Center of Education Statistics, the NCES, they actually did a survey, and 1 in 5 of the educational facilities rate their acoustical quality unsatisfactory or very unsatisfactory. That's pretty harsh. It's obviously there's some acoustical struggles in these buildings, and it's pretty common. Like we see it a lot of times. We're called in to fix an existing space or just to help design a space to be better, and so. What you want in a learning environment is just to be able to clearly understand and communicate with each other so you can learn at the best of your ability. And so it's very, very important to get these spaces right. And you want to not only be able to hear correctly and clearly, but also you don't want to have distractions because distractions take away from your focus and your learning ability. And so distracting noises or privacy issues with sound leaking in and out is all going to impact how someone learns, but you have to be able to hear properly to learn properly, and so it's a big responsibility when we get these projects. So some of the design factors that we look at when we get involved in these projects is that we want to make sure there's low noise so that we're eliminating distracting noises from maybe mechanical units or other spaces that are close to it. That kind of dips a little bit into isolation as well, where we're trying to make sure that the structure is built in a way that is going to block out as much sound as needed, but not more than needed, because more than needed means you've wasted money. And so we're always trying to find that balance in between. And then we also look at room acoustics, so the sound quality itself, so making sure the reverb time is appropriate or there's not focused reflections or slapback echo or different things that we need to deal with. And there is actually a standard for acoustical quality in classrooms. It's not a standard that people have to hit as a designer, but it is a guidelines that you can use from ANSI and ASA, which is the Acoustical Performance Criteria, Design Requirements, and Guidelines for Schools. And so it sets these design factors for us as designers to hit. And so here's a cover of that document. It's many, many pages, and it has a lot of really cool information in it. And we use it anytime that we're dealing with an education building project. So talking about low noise, these distracting sounds that I mentioned, it could be a lot of different things. Like mechanical equipment is one of the biggest ones, like the HVAC, also like any sort of plumbing or things like that could create noise into your room. Usually you just want to locate those units as far away as possible from the noise sensitive spaces. Like you don't want to have them on the roof of like say a choir room or something like that, because when it kicks on it could potentially impact their space. Or if you don't want it to impact the space and it's on the roof, you have to use a lot of expensive materials to make that happen. And so you can solve a lot of things just by distance and being able to place things far away. Also, you can put attenuators and silencers in the duct path to make sure that air noise is not going to transfer through. And then there's also vibration control, because anytime you have something that's vibrating and potentially resonating the structure, if you can cut that out at the source, it's going to be a better result for everybody. Other noise sources would be like AV equipment. So it could be projectors, or it could be audio equipment that's in the room that has fan noise. Anything that has a fan in it could potentially create some noise that would be a distraction for students.
Sure.
So all these things have to be considered when we're trying to keep the noise down. When we're looking at low noise, there's usually a metric called noise criterion, NC rating. So a lot of our architects and MEP consultants know noise criteria as it's just common language, but it's a single number rating that indicates how loud a room is, and it's an unoccupied room. So it's like just noise from HVAC and just the normal ambient noise level of a room. And the thing about it is that it's you take, I'm going to show a graph here. This is an NC graph where you have noise level on the left axis, and then on the x-axis at the bottom, you have frequency. And what you do is you take a meter and you measure the ambient noise level across the frequency spectrum, and you plot it against these standardized curves. And wherever it crosses the line of one of those standardized curves is what the rating for that would be. So the one that we're seeing on the screen right here, it crosses at the NC 25 rating right here, and it doesn't quite cross here at 2,000 hertz, but it does at 160 or so. And so this would get an NC of 25 if you plotted this on this graph. And so we're always specifying NC ratings given the room's application and how quiet that needs to be. For recording studios, it might be 15 to 20 of an NC rating that we're trying to hit. But for a gymnasium, it might be 35 or 40, because that's a louder environment. It isn't as critical as some of those other spaces. There's also a thing in the classroom standard called the room noise criteria, RNC, which is similar to NC. It's just it focuses on the lower frequency spectrum more than NC does. And so it's a similar thing. You see the different curves here for the RNC lines, but the same type of thing. You measure your ambient noise level, you plot it against this, and then you figure out what your RNC number would be. And it's just something, with it being a different metric, it actually looks at things like rumble and lower frequency sounds and focuses in on that a little bit more. And notice on this one here, there's a lot more low frequency energy in this room, and that's why the RNC is maybe more appropriate. So there's, with these low noise standards in the ANSI ASA guidelines, for every different type of room, there is a given NC rating or an ambient noise level that you're trying to hit. And so it's great to have these guidelines as a designer because it gives us like requirements to shoot for. Mm-hmm. So isolation is the next thing here, and I'm showing an image here on the screen where it's showing a noise source in the room and then all the paths it can take to try to get around that wall partition. And it's penetrations, HVAC ducting, airborne sound just going through the wall, vibrations going under the floor. There's so many things that can happen. And it could just be a big distraction for classrooms if you're hearing what's happening on the other side of the wall. I remember once I did a project where there's two classrooms next to each other. It was actually for the military, and it was rooms where they were teaching soldiers different languages. And they're right next to each other, trying to learn a new language. And you could hear the next classroom all the time. Like it would just spill in over the top of the wall. And so it's already hard to learn a new language, let alone if you hear another language coming from from the next classroom. Man. And so it's important just to try to get that focus and try to isolate it as best we can. But we do that with mass and decoupling, try to build up as much mass in that wall and airspace, and then vibration control. And there's all sorts of different materials that we can tap into to make that happen. It's just not easy, unfortunately. Isolation is very difficult to take care of, but with a good plan, it can be done.
Sure.
Another thing when it comes to isolation, a couple metrics to be aware of. There's transmission loss, which is how many decibels at a given frequency a material is blocking for their sound. With transmission loss, it's a great metric because it's frequency dependent. Then there's the STC rating, which I'm sure I've talked about it on the podcast before, is that it's not a very useful metric because it's a one-number rating trying to summarize a very complex problem. And so STC can be very misleading. Two walls could have the same STC rating, but one could be 3 times as effective at blocking lower frequency sounds. And because of that, it's really not helpful. So transmission loss values are a little bit better to look at, but the higher the number is, the better isolation you're going to get. But it's just never a perfect indicator to look at STC alone. So looking at sound pressure level, I like to show this chart because we have decibel level on the left, and then we have some examples on the far right, and then a perception in the center column of what that would sound like. So at 0 decibels, that's the threshold of normal hearing, and then as you go up, it's going to be louder and louder. So 30 dB would be the average home with no stereo or TV on. You've got a conversation from 3 feet away, which is about where we're at right now. now is about 50 decibels. And then inside a car at 35 miles an hour is 70. And you just go up and up. And the louder you get, it starts to be, you notice the perception changes from moderate to loud, very noisy, intolerable, deafening, and then painful. There is a point where sound can get to be physically painful, and that's around 140 decibels and causes you pain, not just being uncomfortable. But with this, it's always good to know what your source material you're trying to block with isolation, because if you're just trying to block a conversation from 3 feet away, it's only 50 decibels, so you don't have to do a whole lot to block that with the partition. However, if it's a rock concert, like there's a performance space right on the other side of your wall, you got to do a lot more for that. So with sound isolation, we created the sound isolation simulator on our website, which allows you to hear how much sound reduction you're going to get from different partitions. It can be really useful in designing these spaces to figure out how much isolation you need, because it's different for every person, and it's nice to go through the simulator and figure out, okay, that would be acceptable for me, and then we can design to that goal. So with sound isolation standards, there's in the ANSI ASA standards, they have typical STC ratings that they shoot for, let's say, a music room with another music room right next to it. The STC rating they recommend is 60, which checks out because that's usually what a lot of studios shoot for, is a 60 STC minimum for trying to isolate the sound. However, a music room next to a corridor is only 45 because it's less intrusive to a corridor than it would be another music room. So there's these standards built into that document. The next thing here is room acoustics. So the room size, typically the larger the room is, the longer the reverb time is going to be. And with that, we have to consider, if the room gets so large, we have to start looking at reverb time as a metric. But if it's a smaller classroom, then reverb time really doesn't tell us a whole lot. It's usually more like looking at reflections and making sure the ambience is okay. But the size is going to dictate things. Typically, you want to avoid concave surfaces in educational facilities, and it's a little foreshadowing for a case study that we're going to do in a little bit. But concave surfaces focus energy to the center of the radius of curvature, whereas convex surfaces scatter sound and push it back into the room, spread out over a wider area. So concave surfaces are challenging, and we'll get into more of that during that case study. We also, for a classroom, they need to function properly for speech applications. Some classrooms do music as well. We need to make sure all of those work together. And a lot of times, the shape of the room is going to impact things as well. Like you want to avoid those concave surfaces, but also you could angle walls and make your life a lot easier acoustically if you just do it properly. Sure. Sometimes you angle it incorrectly, it makes your problems worse. But if you consult professionals like ourselves or others, we can help you and guide you through that process. The surface finishes are really important too. Like hard surfaces like reflective drywall, concrete, marble, things like that are going to reflect that sound back. Then soft surfaces will absorb things like cushions on a seat, or drop tile ceilings, carpeted floors, acoustical panels. So you need to have the right balance between all of them. But sometimes special acoustical materials aren't necessary. Like if you design the room properly with the right angles and the right materials for the surfaces, you can get a good result just on your own. We also look at empty versus full. When we design a space or we model a space, we never usually model it with it empty, because if it's empty, that means the room is not being used. And so that is something that we're going to make sure that however much absorption that people offer into the room, that we are considering that in our design, and we're not over treating the room with acoustical panels and not accounting for how much people are going to offer.
Sure. So with the size of the space, you had said that for a classroom size, you may not worry about the RT, but then for larger rooms, you would.
Yeah.
Where's the cutoff between, okay, this room needs to be we need to look at the RT, whether it's a classroom or not, versus, all right, maybe we don't need to.
Yeah, a lot of times that ends up being about 10,000 cubic feet.
Okay.
Somewhere in that range is where reverb time really starts to kick in, because reverb time is a metric that's meant for larger spaces, because then you have a diffuse sound field.
Sure.
In smaller spaces, you never get that. So it doesn't mean that you can't measure reverb time in a small room. It's just not as accurate and also as useful as it would be in a bigger space.
That makes sense.
Good question. All right, the next thing we're going to look at is that reverberation time, which is the time it takes for sound to decay by 60 decibels. And it's frequency dependent. So in lower frequencies, mid frequencies, and high frequencies, you're going to get different values. It's not just a one number rating. And it can change the way a room sounds, like whether it's like boomy or bright or muddy or warm or hissy, something like that. All of those are a characteristic of the reverb time in the room and the frequency response of the room as well. And we're going to have a target for every room that we're dealing with, and we are always trying to design to that. We can build models to simulate this so that there's no surprises. I don't like surprises on projects, neither do our clients, so we try to do that the best we can on that front. Here's a chart that shows reverb time for common types of facilities in rooms in educational facilities. And so you can see up here, the bottom axis here is reverberation time in seconds, so from 0.4 up to 3 seconds. And then you've got some speech applications, music and speech applications, and music-only applications as you go up. But you notice like a classroom and boardroom, 0.4 to 0.8 second reverb time. Yeah. Really short, right? Like you want that reverb time to be quick because you can understand speech better in rooms that have a short reverb time. But then you go all the way up here to choir and organ, and that's 2 to 3.2 seconds. That's a huge difference in the perception of sound in a room that has a 3-second reverb time versus one that's 0.4. You know, it's just a totally different application. Looking at, let's see, like a small theater might be 0.8 to 1.5. Yeah, so there's some guidelines to go from, but it also requires us to just talk to our clients and figure out what they want, you know, and make sure we tailor to their needs. For classroom acoustics, that going back to that ANSI standard again, you know, a core learning space that has under 10,000 cubic feet, so that would be where the reverb time isn't as accurate necessarily, but there is a guideline here of 0.5 seconds to be the maximum reverb time if it's under 10,000 cubic feet. Between 10,000 cubic feet and 20,000 cubic feet, it goes up a little bit, just 0.6 seconds. And then notice like ancillary learning spaces, it just says no requirement because it just depends on, if it's not a core learning space, they're not going to put limitations on that.
Sure.
We did, just like the sound isolation simulator, we have the reverb time simulator where you can actually hear rooms with and without treatment. And it can be very beneficial for educational facilities to hear how much different it is to hear speech in a room with treatment versus without treatment, and can really help make decisions and making sure that, unfortunately, acoustics is one of the first things that's cut from the budget and one of the first things that people complain about afterwards. This tool is kind of in hopes that it doesn't get cut, right? That you know the importance of it and know it from the very beginning. You can also look at speech transmission index, which is STI. It's a number rating from 0 to 1. 1 would be perfectly intelligible, and 0 would be you wouldn't understand a thing. Right. And it combines a lot of different metrics to create this easy 0 to 1 rating. And it's something that we measure all the time in spaces and make sure that speech can be understood clearly in spaces. So going through, so we talked about classrooms a lot so far. There's some other spaces in educational facilities that could be could benefit from acoustical treatment. The first one would be gymnasiums. Gymnasiums are it's common to overlook it because people just think, okay, it's brick or concrete or whatever, put some basketball hoops up and we're good to go. But it's a place where a lot of times you have, the entire school gets together for events in those spaces, right. And you've got sometimes an inadequate speaker system that is then fighting with the room itself. And if you can have a good acoustical environment like this one that's shown here, has some acoustical panels in the room and also some treatment on the ceiling to help calm down that reverb time so that it's not so harsh in there when someone blows a whistle or they're trying to announce something. You want to make sure that it's comfortable. This happens to be a gymnasium that we did at up in Fort Wayne, Indiana, where they were having complaints that no one could understand when someone checked into a game, like they did basketball and volleyball in this space. people would check into a game and they wouldn't even, it'd get announced, but people were like, who's coming in? I don't know. Like, it was really, really bad. Reverb time, harsh reflections everywhere. And then we treated it. We went on site, did testing, came up with a treatment plan. And the only complaint that we got on this job is that it was so controlled that the opposing coach complained one time because he said that people could hear what's happening in his huddle, and so like that is obviously doesn't happen very often, right. But it's a very well controlled environment now to where they can understand speech really clearly. Mm-hmm. Lecture halls is another place where we need. It's like a classroom, but it's a little bit bigger, and then reverb time plays a bigger factor. But with the excessive reverb time that happens in these spaces, we have to be even more careful with what type of acoustical materials and where it gets placed. And a lot of times these lecture halls, they have a little bit better sound systems than the standard classroom would. And because some small classrooms, they don't have a sound system. The teacher projects their voice. In lecture halls, sometimes you need some added PA. So that can implement some challenges into the room. Cafeterias are another one. Cafeterias are not just places where people are eating. Sometimes there's performance aspects there where there's a stage built into the cafeteria, like this one that's shown here. But also, if you just have a ton of kids in a space like that and they're all being loud, it can be stressful for not only the students but also teachers. And so having a calmer environment can be really nice to be able to control that and just have a more peaceful environment. Another one's fine arts and auditoriums. Like this, we get involved a lot more on these spaces because of our music background. But these fine arts auditoriums are really critical listening spaces. It's where performances are happening. And these students are working so hard on these performances. If they then are put into an environment to show it off to their family and friends, and it's just a cacophony of sound and no one can understand anything, it's wasting all that effort they put into it. And so having a nice environment to be able to perform in is just key for these students, and we like to help on that front. With that, we also have practice in band rooms. Like this is a photo from St. Francis University, University of St. Francis in Fort Wayne, Indiana. And this is one of their ensemble rooms that has some Flex 48 from panels from Acoustical Fulfillment on the walls, and then some geofusers from Orlex on the ceilings and the walls, just to make a nice environment that's mostly diffuse, but they could also take those shields off of the Flex 48s and make it more dead sounding if they want, depending on what they're doing on a given day. But these rooms are really important to make sure it's controlled enough that where practice is fruitful, and allows them to sound their best. So I'm going to do a quick case study here of this classroom that we did at Grace College in Winona Lake, Indiana. The classroom itself that we're going to talk about is actually shown here. It's that circular structure that's on the front of the building there. And we talked about concave surfaces and how that's a challenge. And this one was a big challenge. Yeah. We got brought in after the fact. So the building was built, and then as it was being built, people started to notice this doesn't sound good, and so we got involved to try to figure out how to improve it. So we went on site and did testing. This photograph is actually from where I was doing my testing. You see the microphone there and the portable loudspeaker that we brought in. But the idea for this room was a classroom in the round where the professor would be in the center of the room talking to the students that are sitting around them. And in theory, that's a great idea. It's like it gets more interaction and just a different environment where people can try to focus in on what the professor's saying. However, in practice, it just caused a lot of problems. Right. So with this circular environment, it caused focusing, like that concave diagram that I showed before, focusing to the center of the radius of curvature. Well, the center of the radius of curvature is the center of the room, which is where that professor was speaking, right? And I remember when I was there the first day, I stood in the center and I spoke like I was trying to address a class, and it sounded like there was 50 of me talking. Like and it's just so focused that it almost sounds like it's just inside your head rather than hitting your ears. It's like it's pretty a wild experience, and it's something where that's, I'm sure, what professors were experiencing. That's why we got a call, right? Because it just was not a pleasing listening environment at all. So here's a top-down view of the room. They did plan on some acoustical ceiling tiles in the ceiling, and but all the walls were all drywall, and just a challenging space. So we did some testing. We focused on impulse responses, reverb time, STI measurements, and really tried to dial in what the problem was. It wasn't too hard to figure out because the problem was the room was circular, you know, like and that's causing issues. Looking at the impulse response, this is something where you don't typically see the impulse response looking like this. This is an example of focusing and flutter echo that's occurring in the space, because you see the rhythmic peaks of the reflections coming back to the microphone after the direct sound got cut off, but you see all these spikes that are happening, and you can see that the distance between them is the same all the time, because this microphone was placed in the center of the room, and the time for it to come back to it was always equal, except it just kept bouncing back and forth and focusing in on this room. So this is what the impulse response looked like before we did treatment in the room, and then the next slide here is after treatment. And notice how that phenomenon is pretty much almost gone. You can see a little bit of that still happening, but it's not as great as it was before, and the amplitude isn't as loud. So I'm going to show what we did to solve that. The key here was to use this product from Acoustical Fulfillment called wedge panels. And wedge panels, they make these panels that are an inch thick on one side and 3 inches thick on the other side. So it creates an angled front face of the panel. Because strangely enough, if you were to put just flat-faced acoustical panels on that curved wall, the problem would not go away, because the angle of incidence directly into a panel, there's a reflected component that comes back off of a flat panel. But if you angle that, like these wedge panels naturally do on their own, while still being easy to hang on the walls, it just really breaks out that focusing issue, breaks it up, and doesn't cause a problem anymore, while also reducing reverb time. So this next photo that I'm showing shows you kind of how that wedge panel looks. You see the thin section, it slopes up to a thicker section, and so the front face is always angled. And now you could do it with flat-faced panels, just normal acoustical panels, but you'd have to mount them on the wall with the angle built in, and that's sometimes hard to do. You got to do like wood blocking and create the angle yourself, whereas the wedge panels do it for you. So this was the goal, and in fact we started with panels just circling the entire room where there was no airspace in between them. But we ended up removing every other one because of budget concerns, but the spacing of it was done so that if they ever wanted to go back and add in those panels that were in the void, they could do that and not have to reposition any of the existing panels. But turned out that just half of the panels were enough to make the difference for them. We took reverb time measurements before and after, and in some cases it was up to 73% reduction at 1,000 hertz there. It was 1.76 seconds of reverb before treatment and 0.47 after. And it really wasn't a ton of treatment. Like it really, sometimes if placed correctly and choosing the right treatments, you can really make a great result. Next thing here is the reverb time study. The red line is the reverb time of the room before treatment was done, and the green line was after treatment was completed. So you see that big boost of reverb time at 1,000, 2,000, and 4,000. It's now well within acceptable limits and right on that target line that we were shooting for. Yeah. And this is a picture of it completed, and you got a professor there standing in the center addressing their students. They have like these mobile desks to be able to move around, and just ended up working for them, even though, it was something that had to be done after the fact. And I think aesthetically, the room still looks like it was meant to be that way. Yeah. So that's it. I mean, there's so many things to consider with acoustics in educational facilities, and the main thing I'd just like to point out is that like we would be happy to talk with anybody about this. We love to share our knowledge, and if we're the right fit for a project, like we can help you out with it. But it's tough to do alone. And like just like we're not structural engineers, so I would never want to design a building and make sure that it doesn't fall down, but I'll make it sound good. And so So it's fun to be involved in these projects.
Absolutely.
So we're really curious to see if you had acoustical issues in the schools that you attended as you were growing up. Feel free to comment below if you had any of these issues that we talked about, and we're happy to interact with you on that and answer some questions. And really appreciate you guys being part of the S.O.U.N.D Project. And we'll see you next week.